The first thing that met me wasn't music. Not yet. It was silence. Heavy, dense, the kind that presses against your skin and settles into your bones. The kind of silence you find only in sacred places, where the air feels older than time. The Navy Chapel in Charleston had that silence. It was built to hold the weight of history, high vaulted ceilings, tall stained glass windows that caught the sunlight and fractured it into soft blues and golds across the marble floor, and oak pews polished by 100 years of hands. When the first notes of the organ began, they didn't burst forth. They rolled in, slow and deep, like a tide coming to shore. The great oak doors at the back of the chapel swung open in unison, and the cool scent of the outside air rushed in. I took my first step into the light streaming through the doorway, my heels clicking once against the stone. And then it came. Not a shout. Not a cheer. A command. Sharp, crisp, authoritative, cutting clean through the music like the crack of a rifle. Admiral on deck. In an instant, a sound answered that command. It was not the clumsy rustle of people standing. It was the single, unified movement of 180 sailors, Marines, and officers rising in perfect synchronization. The noise was thunder contained inside for stone walls, the deliberate, disciplined kind of thunder you only hear from people trained to move as one. I knew that sound better than my own heartbeat. My eyes swept over the sea of white dress uniforms. Rows of men and women who had stood beside me through deployments, storms, and operations that would never make the news. Each of them carried stories written in ribbons across their chests, campaigns fought, lives risked, missions completed against impossible odds. Beyond them, in the front pew, sat my family. I spotted my father instantly. Richard Carter, a man who believed in traditions so rigidly it may as well have been carved in stone, was dressed in an immaculate charcoal suit. The fabric alone probably cost more than my first car. But there he sat, a solitary island in the standing sea around him. He did not rise. His face was unreadable to most, but I'd spent 33 years decoding that expression. It wasn't pride. It was cold, calculating disapproval, a mask he wore whenever I defied the vision he had for my life. In that moment, I realized he didn't see his daughter walking down the aisle. He saw a breach of decorum. A spectacle. An insult. I didn't look away. For 3 long seconds, I held his gaze. My chest felt oddly light, no trace of the nervous flutter a bride might expect on her wedding day. Instead, there was a quiet finality, like the click of a lock sliding into place. This was not the first time Richard Carter had refused to stand for me. And it wouldn't be the last time he was forced to. The organ continued its slow, steady march, but its sound felt distant now. My focus tunneled, not toward my father, but forward, toward the altar, where Commander Nicholas Grayson waited in his own dress whites, the faintest trace of a smile in his eyes. Still, I couldn't help but feel the moment stretching in 2 directions. Behind me, the past, the years of friction, of unspoken accusations, of expectations I had never wanted and could never fulfill. Ahead of me, the future, the life I'd chosen, the people I'd chosen, the battles I'd already fought to be here. But for now, I walked through the middle of them both, the echo of that command still hanging in the air. Admiral on deck. And my father still sitting. It had started a week earlier, though the seeds had been planted decades before. The last conversation before the wedding wasn't much of a conversation at all. It was a repeat of the same argument we'd been having since I was 19. Only this time, it was over a video call instead of across a dinner table. My father's face filled the laptop screen from his home office in Savannah, Georgia. Even through the grainy resolution, I could see the shadow settle over his expression the moment I told him. "I'm wearing my uniform," I said simply. His lips pressed into a thin line. He didn't shout. Richard Carter never raised his voice. He preferred the slow burn of disappointment to open conflict. "A navy uniform to your own wedding, Kelly?" His tone was syrupy with disdain. "That's not a wedding, it's a parade. It's embarrassing." Embarrassing. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the familiar cold knot settle in my stomach. I'd heard that tone before, when I told him I was turning down his offer to join the family's construction firm, when I'd been accepted to the Naval Academy, when I deployed for the first time to the Persian Gulf. In his mind, each decision was just another entry on a running ledger of my failures. "It's not about the uniform, Dad. It's about what it represents." "What it represents," he repeated with a humorless chuckle, "is that you can't separate work from life. This is supposed to be a day for family, for tradition. Not whatever this is." I was about to answer when another voice cut in, smooth, easy, laced with that older brother brand of superiority I'd known since childhood. Matt Carter leaned into the camera frame from my parents' kitchen, a coffee mug in hand. "Dad's right, Kel. It's a bit much. People will think you're compensating for something." "Compensating?" I raised an eyebrow. Matt shrugged with a smirk. "I'm just saying, 4 silver stars is impressive, sure, but wearing them to your wedding? Feels like overkill." The knot in my stomach tightened. They could dress it up however they wanted, concern for appearances, respect for tradition, but underneath it was the same old message: you don't belong unless you play by our rules. And their rules had always been stacked against me. Just then, the door to my study opened and Nicholas stepped inside. Commander Nicholas Grayson, my fiancé, wore civilian clothes, but his posture still carried the quiet authority of a man who had logged thousands of flight hours in an FR-18 Hornet. He took in the scene instantly, my stiff shoulders, the faint echo of my father's voice from the laptop speakers, the expression on my brother's face. Nick didn't say a word. He just walked over and rested one warm, steady hand on my shoulder. The simple weight of it was enough to ground me. "Kelly," and my father continued, oblivious to Nick's presence, "I'm telling you this for your own good. You don't have to prove anything. This wedding is about your marriage, not your career. People don't want to see an admiral get married. They want to see a bride." "I am a bride," I said evenly. "And I'm also an admiral. Those aren't mutually exclusive." There was a pause, brief, but loaded. Then came the ultimatum. "If you go through with this, if you insist on wearing that uniform, don't expect me to support this farce. I won't stand for it." The words landed with a thud in the quiet room. Matt leaned back in his chair, clearly satisfied that their family consensus had been reached. I glanced up at Nick. He met my eyes and gave the faintest shake of his head, not to discourage me, but to tell me he knew exactly what I was about to do. The call ended with my father still frowning, Matt still smirking, and me closing the laptop without a single second of doubt. Nick was the first to speak. "You're wearing it," he said, not as a question, but as a fact. "I'm wearing it," I agreed. It wasn't about stubbornness. It wasn't about revenge, either. Revenge is messy, emotional, reactive. This was something colder, cleaner, a correction to a long-standing breach of protocol. If my family refused to recognize my rank, then I would bring them into a world where it wasn't optional. I had played by their rules for most of my life, at holidays, at family dinners, in every conversation that felt more like a performance review than a visit. But this time, they would be stepping into my arena. And in my arena, respect wasn't a favor. It was the law. I learned early in my career that you can fight more than one battle at a time. The Navy taught me that. What they didn't warn me about was that the second battle, the one off the battlefield, can be far more exhausting. For over a decade, I'd been waging 2 wars. The first was obvious: missions that took me halfway around the globe, coordinating operations with carrier groups, responding to crises that demanded precision and calm under pressure. The second was quieter, but just as consuming: the never-ending fight to be seen, really seen, by my own family. To them, I wasn't Admiral Kelly Carter. I was just a Kelly, or worse, Kell, the youngest child, the responsible one only in the sense that I didn't cause public embarrassment. My military service wasn't heroic in their eyes. It was an eccentric career choice, a detour from the path they believed I should have taken. They clung to a carefully maintained fiction. In their version of reality, I was the manageable daughter. The one who'd been good at school but terrible at a life skills that really mattered, like settling down early, marrying a good man, having kids before 30, and joining the family business. I remember one Christmas 2 years ago with surgical clarity. The tree in my parents' living room had been decorated to perfection. White lights, gold ribbons, crystal ornaments that had been in the family for decades. The scent of cinnamon and pine hung heavy in the air. Matt was in his element, standing near the fireplace, glass of Pinot Noir in hand, charming the room with his latest career milestone. He'd been promoted to vice president at a regional real estate firm. Dad raised his glass in a toast. To Matt Carter, building the family name in a way we can all be proud of. A real provider. The applause was immediate and warm. Later, over dessert, I mentioned, almost in passing, that I'd been awarded the Defense Distinguished Service Medal. The reaction? A polite pause. Dad patted my hand as if I'd just told him I'd gotten a good deal on a used car. That's nice, dear. Now, have you heard? Matt's thinking about buying a lake house. A lake house. That was the metric. Property, square footage, an impressive zip code. Not the years I'd spent on deployments or the lives I'd helped protect. It wasn't the first time I'd been dismissed so effortlessly. My promotion to flag officer had been nearly forgotten in the rush to celebrate Matt closing a big real estate deal. When I graduated from the academy, they'd almost missed the ceremony entirely because of a last-minute business opportunity Dad didn't want to pass up. Even my mother, Linda Carter, the eternal peacekeeper, was guilty of quietly reinforcing their narrative. Her strategy was subtle but consistent: a small smile across the table, a gentle shake of her head, and the silent plea in her eyes that said, "Let it go, Kelly. You know how they are." I did know how they were. But knowing didn't make it sting any less. They worried about me, or so they claimed. Not because of the dangers of military service, but because they saw me as alone. In their eyes, a base full of dedicated men and women didn't count as family. In my reality, I commanded some of the most capable personnel on the planet. My co-workers were aviators, SEALs, intelligence officers, people who would lay down their lives for each other without hesitation. And in my world, I wasn't a Kell. I wasn't the daughter or the sister. I was I was Admiral. There was one day that summed up that contrast perfectly. It was a Tuesday morning in San Diego. I was standing in the Fleet Command Center, in front of a massive digital map projecting live data feeds from the South China Sea. A Chinese destroyer was shadowing one of our carrier strike groups, pushing right up against the boundaries of international law. The tension in the room was thick enough to taste. A young lieutenant's voice was tight as he briefed me. The plan vessel is closing to 5 nautical miles. Ignoring all hails. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Maintain course and speed. Deploy all ISR assets. If they want to watch, let them. It was a high-stakes chess match, our steel against theirs, thousands of lives balanced on calculated restraint. In the end, the destroyer peeled off and retreated. On the main screen, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs appeared on video feed. He didn't speak, he simply gave me a slow, respectful nod. That nod meant more to me than every polite "that's nice" dearie I'd ever received from my family combined. And that was the divide. In one world, I was recognized for my decisions, my command, my leadership. In the other, I was still the girl they thought should have taken their safer route. The only person who saw both sides, the Admiral and the daughter, was Nick. He was my equal in uniform and my partner out of it. He never needed to be reminded who I was. He already knew. But my family? They were about to find out. When the video call ended that day, the screen went black, but the sound of my father's words lingered in the room like smoke after a fire, faint, acrid, impossible to ignore. Embarrassing. Farce. I won't stand for it. For about 30 seconds, I sat there staring at the darkened laptop screen. Anger flared briefly, hot and sharp, but it didn't last. In its place came something steadier, colder. It was the same mental shift I'd felt before a high-stakes mission, when all the noise drops away and only the objective remains. I swiveled in my chair to face Nick. "I'm wearing my uniform," I said calmly. He didn't even blink. "I never had any doubt, Admiral." That was the thing about Nick. He didn't see my choices as acts of defiance. He saw them for what they were, statements of fact. But this wasn't just about a dress code. This was about rules. My family had always operated in an arena where tradition, money, and appearances dictated who stood and who Saturday. In that arena, my rank was meaningless. Now, I intended to move the game to my field. The thought came quickly, fully formed. They will see the world I live in. And in that world, protocol isn't optional. I reached for my laptop again, but this time I didn't open the family group chat or check my email. I launched the wedding planning software Nick and I had been using, an innocent-looking dashboard of guest lists, seating charts, and RSVP trackers. It didn't look like a social tool to me anymore. It looked like an operations platform. I scrolled through the list of guests, cousins, family friends, business associates of my father. That section would stay, but the real work was in the add button. If I was going to do this, I wasn't inviting just anyone in uniform. I needed the right people, the ones who would understand without explanation exactly what was at stake here. Men and women who had served with me on missions where failure was not an option. My mind jumped to a memory from the Horn of Africa, a joint operation with a SEAL team where precision timing had been the difference between success and disaster. Those men had moved like clockwork under my orders. And I knew, without a shadow of doubt, they would answer if I called. I started making the calls. Lieutenant Commander Ross, it's Carter. How's retirement treating you? Better with a cold beer, but I'll trade it for a trip to Charleston if you need me. The invitations went out not as polite wedding stationery, but as formal requests, personal summons from their former commander. The final call I made that night was to Captain Mark Razor Adalis, a man whose loyalty had been forged in fire. Razor was the kind of leader you wanted in your corner when things got ugly, calm under pressure, sharp as a blade, and utterly unshakable. Razor, I said, my voice steady, I expect full military honors at the wedding. Customs and courtesies, no exceptions. There was a pause on the other end. Then, a low chuckle. The guys have been waiting for this for a long time. Consider the protocol enforced. When I hung up, the plan was set. Every detail, timing, placement, sequence, would run with the precision of a formal change of command ceremony. The RSVPs for my family began trickling in over the next few days. They were peppered with thinly veiled condescension. Looking forward to seeing what you've planned, Kelly. Should be interesting. They thought they were attending their eccentric daughter's unusual wedding. They had no idea they'd just accepted front row seats to a cultural collision they couldn't possibly control. And I didn't intend to brief them ahead of time. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and cold in Charleston, South Carolina. Even the air seemed sharp enough to cut. The Navy Chapel sat at the edge of the historic district, its white steeple rising against a perfect winter blue sky. The building had the kind of presence that demanded respect: stone walls weathered by decades of storms, stained glass panels depicting scenes of service and sacrifice, a brass bell in the tower that could be heard for blocks when it rang. I arrived early, hours before the guests. The heavy oak doors loomed in front of me, carved with anchors and laurel reeds, their surface worn smooth by the hands of sailors who'd passed through them for generations. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of polished wood and candle wax. The light filtering through the windows turned the marble floor into a mosaic of gold, crimson, and blue. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I pictured my father walking through those same doors. I could see him pausing just inside, scanning the chapel like he was inspecting property he might buy. I knew exactly what he'd notice first: the uniforms. By design, the pews were already filling with them, rows of white dress jackets and blue trousers, gold buttons catching the light, ribbons lined in perfect order. They weren't props. They were flag officers, seasoned commanders, senior enlisted leaders. These were people whose careers were built on discipline, precision, and mutual respect. But my father wouldn't see any of that. He'd see a show. My brother Matt would likely smirk, maybe whisper something under his breath about me being a dramatic. I didn't have to imagine it for long. I heard later from one of the ushers exactly how it went when they arrived. My father, in his tailored charcoal suit and silk tie, walked down the center aisle with Matt just behind him. Their eyes flicked over the assembled officers, the service ribbons, the gold braid. Good God, Aded murmured to Matt, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. She even hired actors for this farce. Matt chuckled. She's always had a flair for the dramatic. Neither of them realized that the men and women in those pews weren't the actors. They were the heart of the United States Navy. Each one had been invited because they'd served with me in circumstances my family would never fully understand. As they settled into the front pew, a place of honor they assumed was their right, they were, without knowing it, sitting in the splash zone of a tidal shift. They still believed they were the center of the story. The irony was almost poetic. I, meanwhile, was in the bridal room down the hall, standing in front of a mirror as my aide made last-minute adjustments to my uniform. The fabric was so crisp it felt like armor. On my shoulders, the 4 silver stars caught the overhead light and held it like fire. Each ribbon on my chest told a story: deployments, operations, decisions made in the dark that shaped outcomes no one outside the Navy would ever know. My father had never once asked me about a single one. Through the closed door, I could hear the murmur of voices in the chapel, the rustle of programs, the creak of pews as guests settled in. A few rows of conversation punctuated by the occasional deep laugh from some of the SEALs Razor had brought. They were in high spirits, but I knew the mood would shift the moment the command came. Outside, the organist began to warm up, the deep notes vibrating through the floor beneath my feet. I glanced at my watch. 10 minutes to go. This was the quiet before a storm, and everyone in that building, except my family, knew it. When the first chord of the processional began, I took one last look at myself in the mirror. No veil. No ivory gown. Just the uniform that represented my life's work. I straightened my cover under my arm, took a deep breath, and stepped toward the door. The chapel doors opened. For a heartbeat, the light pouring in from outside washed everything into a soft blur. Then my vision cleared, and I saw it, a sea of white uniforms stretching down both sides of the aisle, the gold braid and polished medals flashing like points of fire under the stained glass glow. I stepped forward, my service dress whites immaculate, my shoes striking the stone floor in measured, deliberate steps. Every movement was intentional, every detail exact, because in my world, details mattered. The murmurs died instantly. The air seemed to tighten, charged with a kind of energy you can't fake. I could feel it on my skin, a shift in the atmosphere that said, "They recognize you." Then it came. From the front right section, Captain Mark Eraser Idalis's voice ripped through the stillness, sharp, crisp, and unmistakable. "Admiral on deck." The response was immediate. 180 men and women rose as one, the snap of their movement echoing like a gunshot against the stone walls. Heels slammed to the floor, spines straightened, eyes locked forward in perfect unison. It was the sound of discipline. The sound of respect. The sound of my world. I didn't break stride. My gaze stayed locked on Nicholas at the altar, his expression a mixture of pride and quiet defiance, the same look he'd given me on that video call when my father tried to shut this down. But even as I kept my focus forward, I could feel the front pew like a live wire at the edge of my vision. My father. My brother. Sitting. Of course they were sitting. In my world, that wasn't just rude, it was a breach of protocol. And breaches of protocol are corrected. From the corner of my eye, I saw one of the ushers, a young Marine captain with a posture that could have been carved from granite, approach them. He stopped at the end of the pew, leaned down slightly, and spoke in a tone low enough not to disrupt the ceremony but edged with authority sharp enough to cut glass. "Sir, you need to rise. An admiral is on deck." My father turned to glare at him, his jaw tightening. "I'm her father. I don't need to." The captain's expression didn't change. "With all due respect, sir, your relation is irrelevant. You are a guest at a military ceremony. Stand. Now." There was no room for negotiation in his voice. It wasn't a request, it was an order. For a split second, I wondered if my father would dig in, make a scene. But the silence that followed was louder than any argument. I could almost feel the shift as he realized there was no winning this moment. Slowly, awkwardly, Richard Carter pushed himself to his feet. Beside him, Matt stood too, his usual smirk gone, replaced by a pale, wide-eyed expression. It wasn't triumph I felt. Not vindication. Just inevitability. He had spent my whole life trying to make me stand down. And in the end, it took 5 words from a Marine captain to make him stand up. I kept walking, the aisle narrowing in my vision until all I could see was Nicholas. Every step between us felt like the closing of a chapter one hadn't even realized I'd been writing. By the time I reached the altar, I wasn't thinking about the front pew anymore. Or the years of dismissal. Or even the fight that brought us here. I was thinking about the people standing behind me, the ones who had risen without hesitation. The ones who understood the weight of the silver stars on my shoulders without me having to explain a thing. My family had been forced to stand by protocol. My people stood by choice. The reception was held at the Admiral's house on the Charleston Navy base, a sprawling, historic residence with wide verandas, tall columns, and a panoramic view of the harbor. It was the kind of place where the air smelled faintly of salt and history, and where the creak of the hardwood floors felt like a conversation with the past. By the time Nicholas and I arrived, the lawn was alive with laughter and the clink of glasses. Officers in white uniforms mingled easily with aviators in dress blues, the occasional splash of a Marine's red stripe cutting through the crowd. Every handshake, every embrace carried the unspoken bond of shared service. Here, I could breathe. I was no longer the daughter playing dress-up my father imagined me to be. Here, I was exactly who I was meant to be, a commanding officer among my peers, a comrade in arms among friends who had weathered the same storms. The conversations flowed like the wine, quick, warm, threaded with humor that outsiders would never understand. Old deployment stories, quiet references to missions that would never be declassified. And jokes that required security clearances to fully appreciate. It felt like home. Out of habit, my eyes scanned the crowd, and that's when I saw them. My father, my mother, and Matt were seated at a small round table near the far edge of the lawn, tucked beneath the shade of an oak tree. It was the only table without a steady stream of visitors. No one had told them to sit there. No one had intentionally excluded them. But the truth was, they were irrelevant here. In this space, rank was earned, not inherited. Respect was a currency they didn't possess. I watched for a moment. My father sat rigid, staring into his glass as if it might offer an escape. Matt shifted uncomfortably, his gaze flicking around the lawn like a man looking for familiar landmarks in a foreign country. My mother, ever the bridge builder, smiled faintly at anyone who looked their way, though no one lingered long enough to return it. For years, they had occupied the head of the table at family gatherings, their approval the unspoken measure of everyone's worth. Now they were on the margins, spectators to a world they had never bothered to understand. And for the first time, I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel hurt. What I felt was something quieter, something almost like pity. Captain Mark Eraser Adalis appeared at my side, a glass of champagne in hand. He raised it slightly, catching the attention of the crowd. A toast, he called, his voice carrying over the hum of conversation. The laughter faded to silence. Not to the bride, though she is beautiful today, but to the Admiral. May your command be long, your crew loyal, and your enemies always underestimate you. A roar of agreement rose from the lawn, glasses lifted high. To the Admiral, voices echoed. The sound rolled over me like a wave, not the applause of strangers, but the affirmation of those who knew exactly what it took to earn their respect. I caught Nicholas's eye across the crowd. He wasn't cheering. He didn't need to. The quiet pride in his expression said everything. In that moment, I realized I had spent years trying to earn a seat at my family's table. But I had built my own table, and it was surrounded by legends. A year can feel like a lifetime in the Navy. It can also pass in the blink of an eye. 12 months after that day in Charleston, Nicholas and I were living on the island of Oahu, in the official residence of the commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. The house was a graceful old structure perched above Pearl Harbor, with a lanai that wrapped around the back and offered a panoramic view of the water. From that vantage point, the harbor looked almost serene. The grey hulls of the warships anchored there stood like silent sentinels, their decks empty in the early morning light. Beyond them, the ocean stretched out toward the horizon, calm and deceptively endless. Life here had a rhythm I had never experienced before, structured, but not frantic. Nicholas and I had found a balance that worked for us: mornings together, afternoons consumed by briefings, strategy sessions, and inspections, evenings that often ended on the lanai with 2 chairs, a shared bottle of wine, and the sound of the trade winds and the palm trees. On this particular morning, I was alone on the lanai, a steaming mug of Kona coffee warming my hands. I'd been reading through the morning intelligence brief, updates on typhoon relief efforts in the Philippines, a summary of overnight movements in the South China Sea, when my phone buzzed. The sender's name froze me in place. Dad. For a moment, I just stared at the screen. I'd spoken to him only twice since the wedding, both brief, perfunctory conversations during holidays. We'd avoided any real discussion of what happened that day. The message was short. Saw you on the news briefing about the typhoon relief. You were impressive. Your mother and I are proud. 2 sentences. 19 words. I read them again, as if the meaning might shift under closer inspection. Proud. Impressive. These were the words I chased for most of my life, the validation I thought would finally close the gap between us. And yet, I felt nothing. Not anger. Not joy. Just an almost clinical detachment. As though I were reading a status update from a distant acquaintance. Somewhere along the way, the craving for his approval had burned itself out. The account was settled, not because he had finally paid, but because I no longer cared about the debt. Nicholas stepped out onto the lanai, carrying a second mug of coffee. He handed it to me without a word, then glanced at the phone still in my hand. I tilted the screen toward him. He read the message, then looked at me. He didn't say, "It's about time," or "Do you believe him?" He just leaned in and kissed my forehead, a simple gesture of understanding. My thumb hovered over the reply button for a moment, then drifted away. There was nothing to say. No apology would undo the years of dismissal. No argument would rewrite the past. The old version of me would have dissected every word, searching for sincerity or hidden meaning. The woman I was now simply filed it away in her mind, a late entry in a logbook that was already closed. I archived the message, set the phone down, and took a slow sip of coffee. The harbor stretched before me, the ships anchored like chapters in a story still being written. My legacy wasn't in his words. It was right there in front of me, in steel and saltwater, in the crews who trusted me, in the missions completed without fanfare. My father believed a legacy was a name you inherited. I knew better. A true legacy is a title you earn, and an honor you command. The days after my father's message slipped by without any follow-up from him. No phone call. No attempt to set up a visit. Just silence. And that was fine. I'd learned that closure doesn't always come as a neat conversation or a heartfelt apology. Sometimes it's simply the moment you realize you no longer need either. Still, I kept the message. Not because I treasured it, but because it was proof of something small but undeniable. Whether he admitted it openly or not, my father had finally seen me as I truly was. Not just his daughter, not just a Kell, but an admiral. A leader. Someone who didn't bend under the weight of his expectations. The Navy doesn't give you room to linger in personal reflection for long. The next week was a blur of briefings, meetings with foreign naval officers, and preparations for a multinational exercise in the Pacific. My days were filled with the hum of operations, the constant movement of ships, and the steady rhythm of leadership. One evening, after a particularly long strategy session, Nicholas and I stood together on the lanai again. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky streaked with violet and deep gold. Below us, the harbour was dotted with the lights of anchored ships, each one a small, contained world of sailors going about their duties. I thought about the arc of my life, how far I'd come from the girl sitting at a family dinner table, quietly swallowing the sting of being overlooked. How every step, every decision, had carried me further from their version of me and closer to my own. I remembered the aisle of the Charleston Chapel. The snap of heels as 180 sailors rose. The Marine captain leaning toward my father with quiet steel in his voice. The toast from Razor Dallas at the reception. The harbour now stretched before me felt like the natural continuation of all of it. Nicholas broke the silence. You know, he said, the ones who stood for you that day would stand for you again. Anytime. Anywhere. I know, I said, my voice low but steady. That's the family I chose. He nodded once, then slipped his arm around my waist. We stood there for a long while, the wind carrying the faint metallic scent of salt water. I realized then that I had never truly been without a family. I'd simply had to build mine from the ground up. And in building it, I'd learned something my father's world never taught me. Respect isn't a birthright. It's a currency earned through consistency, integrity, and the willingness to shoulder responsibility when others would rather look away. Eventually, I picked up my phone from the table beside me and scrolled briefly through my archived messages until I found my father's text. My thumb hovered over it for a second before I locked the screen again. I didn't need to respond. That conversation, really, that chapter, was over. Instead, I looked out over the darkening water, where the lights of the fleet shimmered like constellations. Somewhere out there, sailors I had trained, mentored, and commanded were standing watch. They weren't thinking about my last name, my family history, or my father's opinion. They were thinking about the mission, the ship, and the crew. And that's where my legacy lived, not in bloodlines, not in inheritance, but in every sailor who knew that when I gave an order, it was for their safety and the success of the mission. My family believed a legacy was something handed to you. I had learned the truth the hard way. A legacy is something you fight for, build with your own hands, and defend every day you wear the uniform. I took a deep breath, letting the salt air fill my lungs. Somewhere in the distance, a ship's horn sounded, a low, resonant note that seemed to echo the certainty I felt in my bones. The ledger was closed. The account settled. And my watch was far from over.